Wednesday night, Alan's perspective. The doorbell chimed sharply at 9:45 that Wednesday night, signaling the unraveling of my wife's double life, though she remained blissfully unaware. As I opened the door, a man and a woman stood there, clad in slightly outdated business attire that hinted at a more formal profession. My instincts told me they were police. It wasn't just their appearance, it was the timing. Trevor and I had planned to initiate our payback scheme this week, and now it seemed like the first domino was about to fall. "Good evening, sir," the woman began. "Are you Alan Turner?" "That's me," I replied curtly. "Who's asking, and why are you here at this hour without warning?" I feigned ignorance, though I had a pretty good idea where this was heading. From behind me, Gloria's voice echoed nervously. "Who is it, Alan?" she called out. Her attempt to sound casual was undercut by a noticeable quiver. She'd been uneasy all evening. She soon appeared beside me, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel, her expression betraying her concern. "I'm not sure yet, sweetheart," I replied, forcing a calm tone. Her brows furrowed in response, her anxiety becoming more evident. The woman's gaze shifted to Gloria. "And you are Mrs. Gloria Turner?" she asked. Meanwhile, the man beside her seemed disinterested, glancing at his watch as if he had better things to do. I stepped in before Gloria could answer, letting irritation seep into my voice. "Before you ask any more questions, how about you tell us who you are and why you're standing on my porch?" The woman sighed, her professionalism laced with a hint of impatience. She reached into her shoulder bag while her partner mirrored the motion, retrieving something from his jacket. In unison, they held out badges under the porch light. "I'm Detective Sergeant Hopkins, and this is Detective Curtis," she announced. "We're investigating an assault that occurred earlier today and need to ask both of you a few questions." This was it, the moment I'd rehearsed for. I contorted my face into a mask of surprise, a reaction I'd practiced in the mirror more times than I cared to admit. "An assault? What does that have to do with us?" I asked, letting irritation simmer in my tone. I glanced at Gloria, who had turned ghostly pale. Her breath quickened, and she clutched the edge of the door for support. Detective Curtis finally spoke, his tone flat. "The victim suffered severe injuries earlier today. Before being rushed into surgery, he identified Gloria Turner as a key witness. Multiple witnesses at the scene also corroborated seeing her there." Feigning confusion, I responded, "Witness? What are you talking about? Who was attacked? And why would my wife be involved?" I kept my voice measured, channeling the clueless husband role. Hopkins cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Mrs. Turner, what's your relationship with a Mr. Gabriel Myers? Why were you with him when he was attacked in the back parking lot of the Newton Motel on King Street this afternoon?" The directness of her question was like a sledgehammer to Gloria's composure. She let out a choked sob, stepping back as her legs seemed to give way. Her trembling hands flew to her mouth and tears began streaming down her face. I turned to her slowly, my expression deliberately transitioning from confusion to concern, and finally, to anger. She couldn't even meet my gaze as her sobs grew louder, and she staggered back, retreating into the house. Friday, Trevor's perspective. Fridays often carry a sense of calm after the chaos of the work week, and this one was no exception. The afternoon had been smooth sailing, and I was wrapping up paperwork when my secretary, Alexis, interrupted. "Mr. Preston, there's a call for you on line 1, she announced. I picked up the phone, adopting my professional tone. "This is Trevor Preston." "Deputy Perkins, Cherokee County Sheriff's Office," came a gravelly voice. "I need to schedule a meeting with you, preferably this afternoon or evening." "Deputy Perkins," I repeated, masking my satisfaction. Alan must have played his part well. "What's this about?" "I'd rather discuss it face to face," he replied evasively. "And I'd strongly recommend your wife, Mrs. Preston, be present for the conversation." I leaned back in my chair, a smile tugging at my lips. "That's unusual but intriguing. Of course, we'll make time. Would 7 p.m. work? My wife will be home by then." "7 p.m. is fine. We'll see you then," he confirmed before hanging up. As I set the receiver down, a wave of satisfaction rolled over me. I rose from my chair, stepping to the window and soaking in the view. Tonight it all comes together, I thought, my confidence swelling. Still, I couldn't let my excitement show. To pull this off, I needed to remain composed. Dialing home, I prepared to give Bella a subtle heads up about the evening's visitor. She'd need just enough of a warning to avoid suspicion, but not enough to uncover the truth of what was about to unfold. The home phone rang 4 times before switching to voicemail, a rare occurrence. Bella always answered around this time of day. Perhaps she was in the shower or had stepped out for a quick errand. I decided to wait, figuring she'd notice the missed call soon enough. But when I tried again 5 minutes later, the result was the same. Voicemail. I glanced at my watch, debating whether to wait longer. A nagging feeling gnawed at me, a sense that something wasn't quite right. After another 10 minutes, I left a message, doing my best to sound puzzled but concerned. Hey Bella, it's me. I'll be home by 6:15. Got a strange call from Deputy Perkins. No idea what it's about, but I wanted to give you a heads up. He might stop by tonight. See you soon. Hanging up, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The message was perfectly crafted, calm, tinged with worry, as if I were an unsuspecting husband caught off guard. The tone hit just the right balance between concern and confusion, masking the quiet triumph I felt. Everything was unfolding as planned. Back to Wednesday. Alan's perspective. By the time the detectives left that Wednesday night, my anger had reached its peak. I had unleashed every ounce of fury bottled up inside me, shouting until my throat was raw. Gloria sat crumpled on the sofa, a pathetic mess of tears and guilt. It took every bit of self-control to keep my rage confined to words. Detective Hopkins and her partner, Curtis, stood silently nearby, observing, ready to intervene if I crossed a line. Their presence ensured Gloria had protection, though she didn't deserve it. When the shouting subsided, I managed to compose myself just enough to give the detectives my version of events. My story was polished, rehearsed, and flawless. An ignorant husband blindsided by his wife's deceit. After answering their questions, I retreated upstairs, letting my rage simmer as I packed. I had planned this exit meticulously. It took mere minutes to grab my essentials: clothes, toiletries, and my laptop, all stuffed into a suitcase with methodical precision. But I wasn't leaving quietly. If this was going to be an exit, it would be a performance. I stomped down the stairs, the weight of my footsteps reverberating through the house. In one hand, I clutched my suitcase. In the other, my laptop and backpack. Gloria remained on the sofa, her sobs muffled by her hands, her entire body shaking with regret. I felt no sympathy, only contempt. The detectives had laid out the grim details of her affair and its disastrous consequences. Twice she had met Gabriel Myers at the Newton Motel, the man she had betrayed me with. This afternoon was supposed to be just another illicit rendezvous until things went horribly wrong. As they left the motel heading to their cars, a hooded man had appeared, emerging from behind a parked van. Wielding a baseball bat, he ambushed Myers near his Lexus. The attack was brutal. The man struck with calculated precision, breaking ribs, shattering bones, and leaving Myers writhing in agony. But the most savage blow was reserved for his groin, an act of deliberate malice. The assailant hadn't cared that Gloria was there, watching. He'd made no effort to hide his identity from her. When it was over, he stood still for a moment, resting the bat casually on his shoulder, his expression one of disdain. Then, without a word, he disappeared into the shadows of the adjacent convenience store's parking lot. Gloria had been paralyzed with fear, too shocked to react. Only when bystanders began gathering, some helping Myers, others filming the scene, did she snap out of her daze. But by then it was too late. Several phones had already captured her standing there, frozen, linking her to Myers. Witnesses described her panicked retreat, fumbling with her car keys before finally managing to drive away. The motel's security cameras and the license plate footage sealed her involvement. Detective Hopkins had asked her bluntly, "Mrs. Turner, what exactly was your relationship with Mr. Myers, and what were you doing at the Newton Motel this afternoon?" Gloria's resolve crumbled under the weight of her guilt. Barely audible, she whispered, "Alan, I'm so sorry, Her voice broke and she dissolved into uncontrollable sobs. Her half-hearted apologies only fueled my anger. I had demanded answers, yelling until my voice was hoarse. When she finally admitted they were at the motel for intimacy, she had the gall to add, "It's not what you think." That phrase, The ultimate cliché of infidelity nearly made me laugh in disbelief. That was when I'd stormed upstairs to pack, slamming drawers for effect. The final act of our sham marriage had played out perfectly. 30 minutes after the detectives arrived, I walked out of the house we had shared for 4 years, determined to distance myself, not just emotionally, but physically. I headed to the hotel I had booked days in advance, bracing myself for the next move with Trevor. The real game was just beginning. Friday, Trevor's perspective. When I arrived home that Friday afternoon, fresh from the call with Deputy Perkins, nothing seemed out of place, at least at first glance. Bella's car was gone, which wasn't unusual. Everything appeared to be falling into place. I dropped my gym bag by the door and headed straight to the kitchen, grabbing a cold Yingling from the fridge. The wall phone blinked, signaling my voicemail from earlier had gone unheard or deliberately ignored. Taking a long sip from the bottle, I scanned the room. The house felt quiet, too quiet. There was a subtle, almost eerie absence of the usual chaos. Shaking off the feeling, I climbed the stairs to the bedroom, kicking off my shoes as I went. After peeling off my shirt and tossing it toward the hamper, I moved to the closet to hang my pants. That's when I noticed it. Bella's side of the closet was empty, completely bare. A wave of simmering rage washed over me as I moved to her dresser. I yanked open the drawers one by one, empty. Her belongings, clothes, jewelry, even her lingerie were gone. I had anticipated this, but seeing it firsthand still ignited a deep, burning anger. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to remain calm. This was it. The game was now fully in motion. As I descended the stairs, now dressed in slacks, a polo shirt, and my moccasins, barefoot, I finally caught what had been bothering me earlier. The den felt off, incomplete. That's when I noticed it. Several of Bella's knickknacks, framed photos, and personal items were gone. I shrugged it off. Good riddance. I told myself I should feel some sense of sadness or loss. We'd spent over a quarter of our lives together, after all. But there was nothing. The anger bubbling under the surface left no room for sentimentality. Besides, I had bigger things to focus on. Deputy Perkins would be arriving soon, and I had a part to play. When the doorbell rang, I was ready. I opened the door to see the deputy standing there, a sturdy man in his mid-40s with a calm yet probing demeanor. He wasted no time. "Mr. Preston," he started, his tone measured but direct. "When did you learn about your wife's affair with Mr. Lance Brewer?" I let my face twist into the look I'd practiced so many times, a perfect blend of shock and disbelief. "My wife's what? Affair? Brewer?" I stammered, repeating his words as though trying to process them. "You're saying she's been cheating on me? With who?" I took a deep breath, pausing as if to collect myself. Closing my eyes for a moment, I made a show of rubbing them with my fingers. The Tabasco sauce I'd discreetly applied earlier did its job perfectly. My eyes watered, turning red, adding just the right touch of raw emotion. "I guess her lover's this Brewer?" I whispered, lowering myself onto the sofa as if the weight of the revelation was too much to bear. The deputy gave a slight nod, confirming my suspicion. "No, I had no idea. Perkins didn't miss a beat." "May I speak to Mrs. Preston, sir?" he asked. "Perhaps she could shed some light on our investigation. Is she here? We'll need her statement as well." I shook my head slowly, as though still reeling. She's gone," I said, my voice shaky. "When I got home, her things were gone. I think she left me. That's the only explanation I have." This was my cue to shift gears, from stunned disbelief to righteous indignation. I shot up from the couch, pacing the room with exaggerated gestures, letting frustration bleed into my voice. When did the sheriff's office start investigating wives' infidelities, while their hardworking, trusting husbands are out there providing for them? I threw in a glare or two for good measure, watching for any reaction from Perkins. He remained composed, his expression neutral, though I could sense he wasn't entirely buying my act. "Mr. Preston," Perkins said calmly, "we don't investigate infidelity. However, we do investigate felony assault and battery or attempted murder when those affairs escalate." His words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, as he watched me closely for any sign of guilt or panic. I widened my eyes, playing the role of the bewildered husband to perfection. Channeling a classic line from Casablanca, I thought to myself, I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on here. But outwardly, I nodded along, masking my inner amusement. Deputy, I'm stunned, absolutely stunned, to hear about this. But you don't really think my wife tried to kill her lover, do you? Perkins gave the faintest smirk, a flicker of amusement that disappeared almost as quickly as it came. No, he replied, his tone steady. I don't think she did. But we are trying to determine who else might have had a motive. Someone like, say, an angry husband. This was it. Showtime. I leaned forward, putting on my most earnest expression. Deputy, I began, my voice firm but laced with indignation. I had no idea my wife was having an affair, and I am certainly not a violent man. Can you tell me exactly when this assault happened? Perkins hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal. It occurred last night around 8:30 p.m. in the parking lot of a motel on Lone Tree Road. There's a bar attached to the motel. Lance Brewer frequented it, often meeting your wife there, according to witnesses. Last night, the bartender noted they seemed agitated during their 2 drinks together. Your wife left first, followed shortly after by Mr. Brewer. That's when the assault happened. Perkins paused, watching me closely as he continued. A witness saw a man in a black ski mask approach Brewer near his car and strike him across the back with a baseball bat. When Brewer collapsed, the assailant continued the attack, targeting his ribs, legs, and the groin area. I flinched slightly, though not enough to betray myself. The mention of the groin attack sent a brief flicker of satisfaction through me, but I buried it beneath a mask of shock and confusion. The deputy pressed on. In our experience, attacks focused on the groin often point to a cuckolded husband seeking revenge. Does that sound familiar, Mr. Preston? I sighed deeply, running a hand through my hair as though overwhelmed. Deputy, I'm still trying to process all of this. My wife leaving me, now this. I let my voice trail off, shaking my head as if lost in thought. Perkins nodded, clearly studying my every move, waiting to see if I'd slip under the pressure. I kept my composure, letting the silence stretch just long enough before meeting his gaze again, maintaining my innocent, betrayed husband facade. I can assure you, I said, keeping my voice firm but not defensive, I had no involvement in the incident you've described. The only connection I have is the one you just mentioned, my wife's involvement with Brewer. Last night I was in my office with Alexis Jenkins, my office manager. We were working on business tax filings. Until nearly 10 p.m., Alexis can confirm that. Perkins gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. Yeah, I already spoke with her after you left the office this afternoon. She corroborated your alibi. I forced a scowl and let some irritation creep into my tone. Then what was all of this about? Asking me these questions, implying I might be involved? My voice rose slightly, just enough to sell the act. Perkins leaned back slightly, his body language shifting as though preparing for a potential outburst. Whoa, Mr. Preston, he said in a calming tone. We have to cover all bases in cases like this. Surely you understand that in situations like these, the aggrieved husband is often our primary suspect until we can rule them out. I crossed my arms, staring him down. And now? I asked, my voice sharp. Have you ruled me out, or are you still chasing shadows? Perkins gave a half shrug, his tone deliberately vague. Let's just say we're exploring other leads at this point. Time to play my next move. If you've got further suspicions or feel the need to ask me more questions, I said, my tone cold, you can go through my lawyer. I held his gaze, letting the silence hang heavy between us. Perkins raised his hands in a placating gesture. Relax, Mr. Preston. I don't think it'll come to that. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card, handing it to me. If Mrs. Preston contacts you, please let her know we need her to reach out to the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office. And of course, if she reaches out to you, I'd appreciate it if you gave me a heads up as well. That's all for tonight, he added, tipping his Stetson slightly. I'm sorry about what's happened, Mr. Preston. Finding out about your wife like this. His words sounded rehearsed, devoid of genuine sympathy. He turned toward the door, but paused as I moved to close it behind him. Remember, he said over his shoulder, if you hear from her, let us know. We're very interested in speaking with Mrs. Preston. I gave him a curt nod and shut the door, leaning against it for a moment as a wave of relief washed over me. For once, I skipped the fridge and the usual beer. Instead, I headed to the dining room, pulled out the bottle of wild turkey from the cabinet, and poured myself a generous glass. Taking a long sip, I let a satisfied smile spread across my face. Alan had come through for me just as I had for him. Raising my glass, I muttered to the empty room, "Sayonara, Bella." Next Wednesday, Trevor's perspective. The Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition felt wildly out of place in a divorce lawyer's waiting room, but I wasn't complaining. Flipping through the glossy pages absent-mindedly, I waited for my appointment. I'd already checked in with the receptionist at Logan Armstrong's office, one of the most formidable divorce attorneys in Cherokee County. Her reputation for fiercely defending her clients, especially scorned husbands, was the stuff of legend. Word had it that she had a particular disdain for cheating spouses, which made her the perfect choice for my situation. A week had passed since the mess with Bella had come to light, and her sudden disappearance was the final push I needed to move forward. I'd wasted no time contacting Logan's office, securing this appointment immediately. They'd sent me a detailed checklist to protect my finances: close joint accounts, cancel shared credit cards, divide savings, change beneficiaries. I'd followed it all to the letter. Well, almost. I still had one last conversation to have with Alan, but that was already in the works. I glanced at my watch. I'd arrived half an hour early for my meeting, deliberately leaving myself time to handle an anticipated interruption. Alan and I had a bit of unfinished business. As I continued flipping through the magazine, the door opened behind me, and I heard a familiar voice at the receptionist's desk. "Excuse me," Alan said, his tone subdued. "I think I might need a divorce lawyer." I didn't turn around, keeping my head down and pretending not to recognize him. "Of course, sir," the receptionist replied smoothly, launching into her usual questions about how he'd heard of Miss Armstrong and his situation. I could tell she was gauging his responses, likely figuring out the best way to schedule him in. Alan sounded hesitant, his voice quieter than usual. "Do you have a restroom I could use?" he asked after the brief exchange. "Certainly," the receptionist replied. "It's just down the hall to the left." I waited 20 seconds before setting the magazine aside. "I'll just need to use the restroom before my appointment," I said with a polite smile, heading out into the hallway. Inside the men's room, I found Alan washing his hands, his reflection in the mirror betraying the storm of emotions beneath his calm exterior. "You all right?" I asked quietly, leaning against the wall and making sure the room was empty. Alan glanced at me, then gave a small, strained smile. "Yeah," he muttered, drying his hands. "I'm okay. It's just, I never knew I could have that much anger inside me. What I did last week." He trailed off, shaking his head as if trying to make sense of his own actions. His voice dropped lower as he looked away. "I've never heard anyone like that before," he admitted. Then he turned back to face me, meeting my eyes. "It scares me, man. It really does." I nodded at Alan, keeping my voice calm. "Yeah, I know, man. Look." I paused, making sure to keep him focused. "We've got a plausible reason for being here together now. Meeting at a divorce lawyer's office? That explains how we know each other. No one's going to question it. But you've got to hold it together when we head back out there, okay?" Alan exhaled heavily, his attempt at a calming breath coming out more like a sigh. Yeah, I've got it," he said, his voice tight but determined. I gave him a quick grin, the kind you give to a teammate before a big play. "Remember, your situation's different from mine. When you get to that third page of the questionnaire, the one about counseling and reconciliation, you know what to do." Alan gave me a faint nod, and with that, we left the restroom, stepping back into the waiting game. 6 months later, Alan's perspective. I don't frequent bars, but tonight was an exception. It marked 6 months since Trevor and I had taken our lives back, a milestone worth a drink, or two. As I sat nursing my beer, I thought back to how it all began. Trevor had come out of nowhere, blindsiding me that first evening. At the time, my life seemed perfect. Steady job, beautiful wife. No storm clouds on the horizon, or so I thought. Trevor had asked me to meet him after work, saying he had something I needed to hear. Skeptical but curious, I agreed. Maybe he was a potential client or had some opportunity in mind. I figured a free dinner and drinks wouldn't hurt. That night upended my world. "He drugged her, Alan," Trevor had said, repeating the phrase like a mantra. "You need to understand that. She didn't set out to cheat on you. He'd laid everything out on the table. Private investigator reports, photos, transcripts. What started as Trevor investigating his wife, Bella, had inadvertently uncovered Gloria's involvement. I hadn't even known Gloria and Bella were friends. Apparently, they'd grown close at work, bonding over lunches that turned into after-work drinks. I'd never questioned Gloria staying out late. She said she needed to unwind. I trusted her. At first, Gloria had been shocked by Bella's revelations about her affair with Trevor, but instead of being repulsed, she'd been intrigued, drawn into the drama, like it was one of her romance novels come to life. According to the PI's report, she'd listened, sympathized, and promised to keep Bella's secrets. Then came the tipping point, the night Bella invited two men to join them at a bar. Gloria had been reluctant, but Bella welcomed the strangers, Gabriel Myers and Lance Brewer. Gloria left early, uncomfortable with the situation, while Bella took the men to a motel. The next week, the men returned, and this time, Gloria stayed longer. That's when everything spiraled out of control. While Bella and Gloria were in the restroom, Myers spiked Gloria's drink. When she returned, she was visibly disoriented, her coordination off, her speech slurred. Myers and Brewer helped her to a motel room, pretending to let her rest. The PI's report detailed the events that followed. Horrific, infuriating. Trevor had drilled it into me. He drugged her. I believed him, but what haunted me more was Gloria's actions afterward. She hadn't needed to go back to Myers again, but she did. He blackmailed her, and instead of coming to me, she let the secret consume her, dragging herself deeper into the mess. That betrayal, the lack of trust, was worse than the cheating itself. I took a long sip of my drink, trying to extinguish the lingering anger. "It's not just that she cheated," I said aloud, breaking the silence between us. "It's that she didn't trust me. I'm her husband. She should have come to me. What kind of man am I if my own wife can't trust me to protect her?" Trevor sat across from me, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "So, are you and Gloria still trying to work things out?" he asked, his tone neutral but curious. "Yeah, we are," I replied, setting down my beer. "I'm still pissed, but it's getting better. She's in assault trauma counseling, and we've been doing couples therapy for about 10 weeks now." Trevor nodded slowly. "You know, Bella was deep into it with those guys. Wouldn't surprise me if she suggested drugging Gloria in the first place." I clenched my jaw, swallowing the surge of anger his words triggered. "Yeah, we've talked about that in therapy," I said. After a pause, I asked, "Have you heard from Bella?" He shook his head, taking a sip of his drink. "Nah, she's gone. Vanished. My guess? She'll resurface when the money runs dry. Maybe I'll hear from her or her lawyer then, but I'm not holding my breath." He gave a humorless chuckle. "Logan Armstrong already has the divorce papers ready. If she stays gone, I can change the grounds to abandonment or irreconcilable differences. Either way, I win." I could see the bitterness still simmering beneath his words. Despite his bravado, it was clear Bella still had a hold on him, even if he wouldn't admit it. Counseling had taught me one thing. Anger like his only came from someone who still cared, no matter how much they tried to bury it. I raised my glass toward Trevor. "Here's to 6 months of getting our lives back." He clinked his glass against mine, offering a small smile, and to whatever comes next. "Well," I said with a smirk, "at least you got the formal separation paperwork filed. Now you're legally free to drop your wife count without worrying about a countersuit for adultery." Trevor chuckled, raising his glass toward me. "You got that right." He took a sip of his drink, then stared off into the distance, his grin fading into thoughtfulness. After a moment, he turned to me and asked, "So you and Gloria finally back to, the deed?" I smiled, choosing to keep my response simple. "Yeah." I wasn't about to give him a play-by-play of our post-revelation intimate life. It had taken months of counseling and effort before we got back to that part of our relationship. But once we did, Gloria had been relentless in her guilt-fueled attempts to make things right. Anything I wanted, whenever I wanted it. It was like she was trying to erase what had happened by outdoing herself. I wasn't complaining, but I made sure not to push too hard. I still needed her to heal, and for us to rebuild trust. The sound of movement behind us, followed by a discreet throat clearing, snapped both of us out of our conversation. We turned to see a woman standing there, a vision in a dark green cocktail dress. The neckline plunged, and the high slit showed off a long, toned leg. Trevor and I both froze, momentarily caught off guard. "So," she said with a knowing smirk, "you two know each other, I see." Something about her seemed familiar. And then it clicked. Sergeant Hopkins?" I stammered. "Well, as I live and breathe. I didn't expect a policewoman to look this good off duty." Her smirk widened. "Actually, it's Lieutenant Hopkins now, but that's just my professional name. When I'm out with my husband, I go by Mrs. Perkins." She gestured to a tall, well-built man in a sharp suit who had just joined her. His presence was commanding, though I didn't recognize him at first. Trevor, however, visibly stiffened. "Hello, Mr. Preston," the man said, his voice steady as he eyed Trevor with mild suspicion. Then turning to me, he extended his hand. "Todd Perkins," he introduced himself. His handshake was firm but not overly aggressive. Trevor cleared his throat. "Alan, this is Deputy Perkins," he said, his voice tight. "The one I told you about, the guy who handled Bella's case a few months back." I raised an eyebrow but stayed silent. "And I worked the Woodstock PD investigation involving Mr. Turner and his wife," Lieutenant Hopkins, Mrs. Perkins added with a faintly amused smile, glancing between Trevor and me. Trevor quickly jumped in. "Alan and I met at my divorce lawyer's office. Turns out our wives knew each other and were involved with the same guys in those incidents. We stayed in touch after that. Now we meet up to, commiserate." "That's one way to put it," I said, stepping in to move things along. "Trevor's wife disappeared, but my wife and I are working on patching things up." Lieutenant Hopkins' smile thinned. "I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Turner. For what it's worth, I hope it works out for you both." Her tone shifted slightly, becoming more measured. "By the way, we still have an open case on the attack on Mr. Myers." I grimaced and took a long pull from my beer, saying nothing. She continued, her gaze steady. "He's still in rehab for his leg. It looks like he'll have a limp for the rest of his life. His arm's recovering well enough. Good thing he's right-handed." I felt nothing but indifference towards Myers' recovery. I nodded once, keeping my expression neutral. "His wife, Bella, divorced him," she added with an edge to her voice. "She took their 2 kids and a hefty portion of his finances. Oh, and about his, reproductive organs. They're functional, but let's just say the motility is low. Odds are slim he'll be having more kids if he remarries. Even cops, it seemed, enjoyed a bit of karma catching up to a cheater." Deputy Perkins chimed in. "And Trevor, if you ever hear from Bella, let her know we're still looking into the attack on Mr. Brewer. His injuries weren't as bad as Myers's, but he's racking up medical bills, and his wife Riley filed for divorce right after the incident." "Tough timing for him," Trevor grunted, his tone flat. "Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy." The Perkinses exchanged a glance, clearly entertained by Trevor's bitterness, but didn't comment further. "Well, you gentlemen have a good evening," Deputy Perkins said, taking his wife's hand as they headed toward the door. Trevor and I turned back to our drinks, the silence between us stretching for a few minutes. Finally, Trevor broke it with a low voice. "You did get rid of that bat, right?"